Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Mission Driven Podcast. I'm your host, Travis Walker, and in today's episode, we'll be discussing how to align your leaders to create missional harmony in your church. Mission Driven is an endeavor of the North American Division of Seventh-day Adventists to guide and support pastors, administrators, and church leaders in their effort to revitalize and unify the church's mission for the 21st century. You can learn more about it right now by checking out mission-driven.org. Well, as leaders, it is easy to assume everyone on the team understands the vision and how their particular ministry supports its accomplishment. But far too often, that is not the case in reality. Without regular, healthy accountability, it is not a matter of if leaders will go rogue, but when. In this episode, Mike and I discuss the reasons why church organizations in particular tend to balk at accountability and what healthy accountability looks like in a mission-driven church. If, like me, you have often struggled to hold yourself and others around you accountable to the mission, then I'm sure you'll be encouraged today as we take another deep dive into Mike's workbook, Mission Driven Manual. All right, well, without further ado, let's get right into today's episode.
Your mission, should you decide to accept it.
Your mission, should you choose to accept it.
Go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world.
This tape will self-destruct in 5 seconds.
All right, Mike. Well, it's great to have you back for episode 8 of Mission Driven Podcast.
Yeah, can you believe it? We're at episode 8.
I know. It has been a journey, and of course, Mission Driven in itself is a journey. And so we're going through the 7th habit, the 7th chapter in your book, Mission Expedition Manual, today. And we're going to be talking about the discipline of mission alignment. So why do we struggle so much with organizational discipline? And because it seems to me that the commitment that we initially make is tested through this discipline, whether we are or not. So talk a little bit about our struggles with discipline.
Okay, so it is just inherent, as I've mentioned in previous podcasts, for altruistic organizations. It can be churches, it can be schools, it can be, community not-for-profits. I worked with a director of a sexual abuse clinic that wasn't a part of our church community, coached him for a while because he was a new administrator. Whatever the not-for-profit is, it is easy for discipline to slip because we are not in it for the money. We're not in it for profit. We're not trying to build a financial empire. We need money to function and do our work, but we're in it for other bigger reasons. It seems like the material type compensation. And so because that is true, there's always a downside, remember, to every strong side. The downside is that we tend to not be as concerned with outcomes. We tend to not be specific about outcomes, and we like to describe outcomes as something that is that sounds inspirational, that brings energy, that brings hope and courage, but are usually not realistic in terms of measurable things by December 31 or whatever your period of time is you're working in. So it's part of the nature of church. And the problem is that's one of our downfalls. It erodes our credibility when we talk flowery statements, but we don't make anything happen. And if you're new to the church in a couple of years or 3 years, you see that this isn't really amounting to anything that's different, then all of a sudden your disillusionment takes over. And this is the sad part for me, we learn to live with disillusionment without questioning it. I believe God has a better picture. In fact, the Old Testament was that way. God had clear directions on what he wanted to do. And in the New Testament church, there was concrete things happening. And God's people were seeing progress that could be counted and could be quantified even.
Yeah, and I also think discipline is work, right? It's hard work. It's not so much like the feel-good stuff like you were just describing that we get in a sermon, we get at a weekend conference. You have these spiritual high moments, and we live for those, right? I mean, that's what brought us into ministry. That's what keeps us going to some degree, is that you have these high spiritual, mountaintop experiences where you're either experiencing it or even you're seeing God use you, or something that just really is inspiring. And usually there are events, right? Usually they're focused around events and certain times and places. And those are easier because they're infrequent to some degree. But then discipline is something that requires that every day, or at least every week. And it doesn't always feel good, and it sometimes is literally just work. So I think there's that side of it as well. I think we kind of are, I don't want to say Holy Spirit junkies, but there's some level of truth to that, right? Where we kind of are brought into the church for the feel-good side of it more than and it kind of relates to what you were just saying about the practical, the outcome side of it. And there's not as much of a concern on that end, even with people who give, right? So it's like we're not even really challenged by our givers because they're happy with the feel good times, and so they're essentially giving tithe and offering more for that. I know that sounds kind of crass, but to some degree, that's more what they're concerned about than the actual outcomes. And so as pastors, we're not necessarily even held accountable by the people who are supporting the church for these outcomes. So we really have to be internally motivated. We have to have this really strong understanding that that's not enough. Like the feel-good times, those are great, but if we're really going to accomplish the mission, it's going to take work. We got to roll up our sleeves, and we've got to be disciplined. So that's really where we are in the journey right now. This is the hard part, right? I mean, we've been talking a lot about, the strategy and getting people aligned and writing it down. And we have the vision. We're starting to recognize the values that we need to support this new vision. And now it's discipline. So how do the roadmaps help with that? We have this written strategy. How do the roadmaps help us implement the strategy, keep everyone on pace for the vision that we've written and hopefully we're going to accomplish?
Well, there's been a lot of board meetings where we talked about plans in our churches, and I've done that many times. Then we move into the new year or what have you, and we try to execute on the plan. It doesn't take too long before the plan gets sort of laid aside because the circumstances change. Things happen that we didn't plan on, and that's normal. And we get to the end of the year and we look at our plans and we say, wow, we didn't get there. We did get this one thing done, but there's maybe most of these things did not get addressed. And so we perhaps put them back on the plan for the following year. So herein lies the challenge. It's like a wilderness trek with a flashlight in the dark. I've used that illustration too. but it's not going to be clear for the next quarter mile how your path is going to go. You can put the light right out in front of you, and you're going to need to take the flashlight out every week in the church in the dark and look at the next step. And you will then come across a brook, and you didn't think about there being a brook there. And you got to find a way to jump over the brook or put a log bridge or something. So there is continual adaptation in reality. That is more the case today than it was in the past. All the time we're adapting, all the time things are changing. So the answer forward then is to not create a plan, pass it out to the board, and look at it again in a few months. The thing is to create a plan and then take it out every week and look at it. And look at it with your key leaders and ask who's going to do what by when. And it's those questions, those conversations that are uncomfortable because somebody forgets, somebody gets busy, it's harder than they thought. You have to scrap this one, you adopt a new idea in its place. All of that stuff is happening in the whirlwind of ministry, ongoing ministry. And so it's a continual adjustment.
Yeah. And so what are ministry roadmaps? Like, because that's a big key ingredient in mission driven as far as the implementation side of it. So just in layman's terms, like I know in the materials, it's a sheet of paper and there's some objectives. But again, like how does that, how does that work with the overall vision and strategy that we've put together as a church? But now the individual ministry leader, they've got this sheet of paper. It says ministry roadmap on it. What do they do with it? And like how would you use those types of things in weekly? I mean, minimally monthly, but like you were just describing weekly, that's a revelation in itself compared to what we normally do in the church. So just talk a little bit about that, just so that people are clear.
Well, you have to get your team together. You may do it in a church only on a monthly basis, but you got to first start out your first meeting with who's going to do what by when. And if you got a big project, then you need to break it down by months. So in January, we're going to do this. And in February, we're going to do that. And then in March, this is going to happen. And you have to know who's going to do what by what date in January. And you have a meeting with those people and you follow that with another meeting and you see how it happened in 30 days. Perhaps 30 days may be it for you. You have to have some ability to handle discomfort. Remember the book 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni. In the book Advantage, he presents those 5 dysfunctions as positives. And so the first of all is trust. And then there comes conflict. And so these are the 2 foundational parts. There are 3 other team disciplines too. But those 2 things of creating trust within a ministry team are really important. And that's when you say, we're not perfect and we're going to help each other be successful. And Jane, you had some things happen and you didn't get your assignment done. How can we help you get it done for February so we can stay back on track? So you create a sense of trust where you can be vulnerable with each other. And then you get comfortable with conflict. We're not so good with conflict. I don't like conflict, but we have to do it. The higher up in leadership you go, the more conflict you'll have to tolerate. So then you have to learn to live with discomfort when you sit down at the end of February and whoever did not get their thing done in January also didn't get it done in February. And then you're behind in another area or two, and you don't jump on people, but you say, well, how can we work together now? We're a family, we're a team, but we're working together for this ministry objective by the end of June. Let's say that's a longer project. And so you have to live with the discomfort. And you may have to up the accountability meetings if you're sliding for the first 2 months. Maybe check in every week or 10 days with your team on phone, on Zoom, whatever. So that's a real talent to handle that kind of thing, to handle holding a team accountable, and when they're a team of volunteers too. See, these are not staff positions generally. So it takes tolerance, it takes patience, it takes spiritual discernment, and then you got to ask yourself, well, maybe God isn't wanting us to do this. What else does God want us to do in place of this? So it's a little bit like a wrestling match. If one move doesn't work, you have to find another move. And you just keep working until something happens that allows you to pin that project down.
Yeah, I like that. And I also think, what you were just describing is creating culture essentially around accountability. So there's this culture that we have normally, which is to not be accountable or to, not have the regular meeting. It's kind of like, well, laissez-faire rules the day for many churches. If you get things done, great. If not, that's okay too. We love you. It's this grace-based approach, which it makes sense to some degree, right? We don't want to be seen as taskmasters, and we don't want to be seen as legalistic. We want to love our people, specifically when we're pastors. We don't want to be seen as overbearing. At least I don't. But when you get people together, right? And if you can create that culture where where you're lifting each other up, and like you're saying, hey, we're doing this together. Let's meet, let's talk. And as ministry leaders see the other ministry doing something, it kind of works to motivate them. And if you can get people doing things even cross ministry, like you were saying, to do things together. I've been trying to do that in my church here in Daytona. It's been great. We did the same thing. We upped our meetings to every week, and that was a big culture change for here. And we started of course, we still have our regular monthly board meetings, but we started what we call ministry council, and it meets Sunday evenings, and it meets every week on Zoom. And we have all our ministry leaders. They come in, and a lot of times we're just sharing testimonies or we're having prayer. But there's this overall feeling of support for one another and encouragement to keep doing your ministry, and there's an opportunity there where it's not business related like the board meeting usually is centered on. It's more relational, it's more supportive, it's more prayer based, it's more testimony based. And I've seen a huge change. I mean, my church, because of these leaders and because how excited they get, that is trickling down into I think the ministry effectiveness of our church right now. So talk a little bit about, that culture of accountability, and just kind of maybe you can add a little bit to what I was just sharing about my own experience.
Well, a culture of accountability, you said it so beautifully. It's in the context of prayer and loving one another and support. It also there has to be a spiritual dimension of discernment of how the Spirit is working. So it isn't so much about, you said you're going to do this, why didn't you do it? Even though those are things you have to say. But it's also saying, this is where leadership, I think, comes in. You have to say, well, this didn't work and this one didn't work. What is God asking us to do? Our big goal by 2 years from now, our vision is this, this, and this. And what else may we do to be able to get that done? And you begin to think of other things that may not have been on your plan for the year, and you move toward trying new things, and it becomes an experimentation context. That's what it's going to take to make it work. And then you create accountability for that one too. But leadership in church is part discipline and courage, and it's also spiritual discernment and wisdom, and then relationships. So you got three things going. You got accountability, you got courage, you have discipline, and it's hard not to go soft on that. But there's no choice if you want to be a faithful leader for God, I think. Secondly, you have this adaptability that must come in through the Spirit's discernment. And then the real thing that greases the track is the relationship side. So the pastor has to continually be looking for new people who can come in and do a ministry role that you may not have even thought of. God has to be helping that leader discern what else there may be that you can do and how you can groom somebody for leadership who may have been on the periphery of the church and now is actually doing so well in children's ministry that you're thinking about handing the whole VBS program to them for the summer. And so this thing is a dance, so to speak. It's you look where to put your feet as you walk your way across this uncertain path. But this is the thing. There is joy in it when the Spirit of God is leading you. Secondly, there's joy in it when you get the result of doing the same things over and over, even though it doesn't feel good. So one day it feels good to have a board meeting or ministry team leader meeting and ask people how it's going. And then 2 weeks later or whenever, it doesn't feel so good because you're tired and you have this and you have this crisis, and somebody on the team has already suffered some challenge, and you go and call your group and you talk about what God is calling us to do, and you pray for the people who are struggling, but you still ask the questions and you still try to say, God, what do you want us to do now to keep moving? That thing of consistency in leadership, not dependent upon mood, ups and downs, challenges, even though you're not insensitive, that creates its own reward package. It brings a sense of steadiness and permanence to the church's life.
I really like that because you just kind of brought up just the two almost balancing factors that we're trying to maintain through this journey. You know, we have the goal or the vision, which is structured. It's clear. It's tangible. We can taste it, touch it, feel it. It's something we're going toward. And yet, to get there, we have to be adaptable. We have to constantly, be focused on that thing, which is not something we can let our eyes off of. But at the same time, we can't walk in a straight line. It's you're walking in different ways and turning and twisting depending on the terrain you're in that moment, which I think you were using the metaphor of a flashlight. And so these meetings, these accountability meetings can be these, okay, let's shine the light of where we are on the path at this moment and in relation to where we're going. And the ministry roadmap is the detail about, at least at this stage in the journey, this is what we need to do. And those things can be updated and changed as needed, as long as we're still going in the same direction. We don't want to change directions constantly, because that's just going to frustrate everybody, and you're going to lose that momentum. But as long as you're going in the same direction, the being adaptable and changing is not necessarily a bad thing, right?
That's right. And this whole context of accountability and openness and being willing to confront but bear the burdens of others who are struggling and suffering, but staying with it, that goes to the third point in the Lencioni model of the 5 dysfunctions of a team, or the way the teams work best, and if you put it positively, which is commitment. So when you weather that storm of accountability and conflict and perseverance and keeping on, even though there are times when the mood may not feel like it, that brings out of the group then a sense of commitment. And that's where the Spirit of God begins to see fulfillment for that accountability. They realize it's worth it. That's sort of the payoff for the commitment, is that accountability becomes something they own. And then that leads, by the grace of God, to results.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting that you brought commitment back up, like I mentioned in the beginning, but it's almost like you make an intellectual commitment at the beginning of the journey, but here you're making that emotional commitment. And
Yeah.
So you need both of those, right? You need to intellectually commit to the vision, because it's like, yeah, that's where we need to go. But what you're saying, like what I hear you saying, is that emotional commitment comes later, and it comes as you stay consistent and you start to see the results. Even if they're small at first, the benefits of being disciplined become in themselves motivating factors to keep going. So yeah, this is great. This is insightful. As we're talking, I'm like learning in my own journey. So this is great. So why is it then that pastors, some of us, a lot of us, I would say, we have a fear of accountability, with fear of holding people accountable? You've already mentioned it's uncomfortable, but is there some sort of emotional issue that that we have? I know you do a lot of coaching, and so this kind of gets back to the emotional side. We're talking about emotion. That's really important in driving our progress in this journey. So what are the emotional barriers that sometimes you've seen existing within leaders' hearts, that either it's something that's happened to them in the past? What are some things that we have to overcome to really do this well?
Yeah. Well, there's a book I read by Carey Nieuwhof. I didn't see it coming. I think is the name of the title. There's a subtitle about things that will undermine leaders. And it talks about some of these. And so there are challenges with human beings. And this is something I'm beginning to understand even more deeply. I recently had a birthday, and so I know I'm a little older now, but I'm still growing in maturity at this age. I'm still realizing insecurities I have, trying to get even more clear about those, and knowing what may sometimes trigger things that aren't helpful. So there's things like pride, and there are things like insecurity and wanting to not let people see who we really are. There are things like not feeling safe in our church environment. I read a study just today about how resilience in the workplace increases exponentially when the employee thinks that the leader and the senior leaders are trustworthy. It creates a tremendous benefit to the employee to do better work. And that's been done through research, documented. So there are all kinds of things that come in the way with human beings. I think trust is one of them. I think there is a little bit of indolence that creeps in with us at times. We don't want to have to be held to accountable, and we sometimes are understand how hard it is to be a leader. And I recall when I was a pastor, been a long time now, but I didn't always trust the leaders in the conference, et cetera, to understand how hard it was where I was working, what I was dealing with, the stuff I was fighting, so to speak. I think those conversations about creating a place of safety where a pastor can be vulnerable, I think that's helpful too. So there is this challenge. We have to grow the leader. Now, I believe in the mission-driven concept. I think it has so much good in it. But we also have to grow the leader's sense of self, the leader's sense of identity, the leader's sense of security in Christ, and the leader's discomfort, allowing the leader to experience discomfort with being not a perfect person. Those kinds of experiences of growing the person into a more whole person, emotional sensitivity or awareness, what do you call it, emotional intelligence. Those things all contribute, I think, to a higher degree of comfort with accountability, especially if the people who are calling for accountability are people who have built trust with the employee.
Mm. Right. And it goes back to what you were saying before about how trust is the core of an effective team. And so we as leaders need to experience that as well. We can have others trusting us, but if we don't trust them, or we're having issues with trust with our leadership, we're still going to be emotionally stunted or handicapped in some way that prevents us from holding in a healthy way others accountable. Because we haven't even experienced it before. I mean, that sounds crazy, but there may be some pastors who have never been held accountable in a healthy way, and it's always come across as a report card, more than somebody who really cares about them and their growth and they're part of the team, they're part of the family. It's like you're just trying to get a good grade on the card, and that's accountability, but there's so much stress there, and it's so many things that are sometimes out of our control. We could either be tempted to fudge the numbers, which then violates our own conscience, or we just avoid it. So, I think there's some work to be done there. And maybe this is something that goes beyond just a pastor's ability in his own or her own context, but organizationally, creating these types of environments where we can learn accountability in a healthy way that can come back and translate in the local church setting. So let's get back to the whole ministry roadmap. If we're going to, a lot of this sounds like management, and we're also talking about leadership. So can a pastor be a good leader and not a good manager, but still be effective in this process? And if he or she's not a good manager, could this be delegated and yet still the overall tone and the role of setting the example could still fall on the leader, but maybe if they're not adept at managing people, could that be subsidized, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a good question. So all of us aren't everything.
Right.
So that's one of the reasons why leadership is not a recipe, because you have gifts that I don't have, and I have gifts you don't have. and somebody else is going to be another profile, so to speak. So we have to be true to who we are. I think doing something like the Strengths Finder 34 can be helpful to a person, and looking at what the top 10 strengths. I recommend the $50 version, and then look at the blind spots for each one of those. Both of those are helpful, the positives as well as the blind spots. Then know what your strengths are, but it doesn't give you an excuse for not getting done what has to be done. So there are two things. There's management and there's leadership, if you want to break it down that way, and it's a good frame to think about at times. Leadership is knowing where you want to go, and it's more big picture. Management is knowing how to get you there in a processed way. You've got to have both things functioning for you. If you are not a natural manager, you need to pray that God will send you some people in the church who are. But here's the thing. You can't just toss it to them and say good luck. You have to meet with them regularly and find out what's happening, so you can be abreast of how things are proceeding and what are the pieces that may be getting left behind not by purpose, but by oversight. And so whatever it is you need to get done, you can get others to do it, but you need to stay close to them and in communication with them. You always have to have the ability to have confrontational conversations too with the people to whom you delegate things that are leadership oriented, so that you are still are not abdicating your leadership in the larger context. So if you can get others to do things for you that you're not as good at, you're a wise person. But there has to be this balance of delegation and communication, ongoing communication. And I like to think of it as you have to be still responsible for the health of the organization. So you may not run certain aspects of church life. Let's say you don't run community services and you don't run the finances, and maybe you don't even manage the building project, and so on and so on. But you have to make sure, your job is to make sure that the work of God is being stewarded correctly. And that takes a lot of conversations, and it takes a lot of prayer and making sure God is informing you.
Definitely. And it also might involve coaching, right? You've been an advocate of coaching. You've received coaching, and now you do coaching. And so talk a little bit about, when it comes to this aspect of the journey, how could a coach benefit, or someone experienced in the same direction or the goal that you're in with your church at the moment? How can somebody with wisdom or a coach be beneficial in supporting a pastor in this process of the journey?
Well, a coach is a person who is an equal to the person being coached. They're not over them like a supervisor, and they're not under them, but they are like an unseen friend, unseen by the church or whatever the organization is that the pastor is leading in. And so the coach is there to find out what the person being coached wants to do, what their strengths are, what their growth areas are, and every person has growth areas. It's just the way it is. It's okay too. It's just okay. It's not okay not to address them, not to be aware of them, and look for workarounds and others who can help you. But it is okay to not be perfect. Very okay. And then the coach is there to help hold you accountable for your next steps. So every coaching conversation has to have a goal. You can't just call somebody up on a coaching call, in my opinion, and say, how you doing? How's it going? Are you feeling good? Are you happy? You're healthy? Are you taking care of yourself? Blah, blah, blah. You can do that. You can do some of that, but you got to spend 80% of your time, or 75% of the time on that call. What is our goal for today? What do we need to do in order to get to where your next step is? At the end of our time together, what do you hope we will have as an outcome? What are the obstacles to getting to that outcome? Why is this important to you? And how do you want to begin to move toward that outcome? And then at the end of the line, the coach at times may offer principles. I have learned, or I read this and this. What do you think about that principle or idea? But at the end of the line of that session, the coach should be asking them, what are you going to do now? What do you see your next step being? And it's even helpful for the coach to ask, what was the most helpful part of our session today? So that coaching has a direction. It has an outcome. It has a way that the person who's being coached is moving forward. There has to be movement in every coaching conversation.
Mm.
So if you do coaching like that, it takes some energy, it takes some talent on the part of the coach, and it takes mainly focus, but it's really helpful to a person. Now, when a pastor is using coaching with his ministry leaders or her ministry leaders, the pastor and everybody who does coaching, when it's with somebody that is working under your direction or what have you, you can't just coach those people into their accomplishment of their goals. The coach has to first make sure the expectations are communicated clearly if there are mission critical expectations. And then you move into a coaching conversation about, what are your resources? What do you think your next step is? What are your obstacles for there? What do you think you may do? How do you sense God leading you at this point? Those are good questions, coaching questions, open-ended questions. That's very helpful, but you can't coach somebody who's working under your leadership into all of the directions they need to go for the mission of your organization. You have to differentiate between coaching conversations, which is about eliciting the creativity of this person you're coaching toward finding their solution, and balance that with communicating expectations. If you get that going, it's a sweet spot for the leader.
Yeah, that sounds, I think I get it, because you have to, as the leader, you still have the expectations that the person under you has because they've taken that responsibility on and they're part of a team. And so they need to understand their role in the process of accomplishing the big goal or the vision. But then once that is clearly understood by the person, then you want them to take ownership of their task. And that can be done best by coaching, because you don't want to just sit there and tell them you need to do A, B, C, D, E. That's exhausting. And most people don't have the energy to just sit over and micromanage people. So what you're saying is the big picture is clearly communicated. The person understands that. And then you get underneath right on their level and you encourage them to find the solution on their own, to take that ownership. And I can see how you're really kind of playing two roles, but it all is, encompassed in that team mindset. So, wow. Yeah, that's some good advice there. Some good thoughts to ponder. And what do you think about peer-to-peer coaching, like when it comes to pastor? Can two pastors who are on the mission-driven journey coach one another. And what do you think about that? I think we've talked about that as a goal with mission-driven, is to have some peer-to-peer coaching as well. So what? Just speak about that for a couple minutes.
Sure. I think that is a very helpful thing potentially. And to have these conversations with other people who are like-minded, even team coaching, even clusters of 3 or 4 or 5, 6 people, groups of pastors meeting sometimes maybe every few weeks or something. Those are really good things, because there's a blessing to be gained from that. Lately, I've been thinking about the life and ministry of Jesus, reading through John 3 today. Everything Jesus did was done in the context of community. He was trying to win the Jewish people back in those days when he was first starting his ministry in John 3. He was talking to Nicodemus. Jesus was always looking at it from the perspective of community. He did his work with a group of disciples. He enlarged that group to 70 when he sent them on a mission. God always seems to find fulfillment in working in a community of people. And I think a community of leaders who coach one another could be very helpful too.
Yeah, I'm excited about that as a possibility moving forward, and I definitely personally want to be involved in that. And I'm sure as that becomes available, we'll be communicating that through the mission-driven website and other communication that you can receive, getting on our newsletter. There's lots of ways to stay connected with mission-driven, because this is still kind of at the beginning stages. This is a new movement, but we want to see a lot of pastors and churches adopt this mission-driven mindset, so we can, as you said, we want to go home. We want to follow the example of Jesus, so we can do the work of Jesus and ultimately spend eternity with him. And so, just kind of to wrap it up today, it seems like a lot of work. Is it worth it, Mike? Is it worth it?
Yeah, it's worth it. Here's the thing. When you grow people and they see the kingdom of God being built up in their community, among their congregants, or in their place where they live and work and so forth, when people start to see the Spirit of God move and change lives, there's nothing that compares to it.
Amen.
It's worth it.
Amen. Well, thanks again, Mike, for another great episode. If you are joining us for the first time today, we want to encourage you to go back. We have 7 previous episodes to this one that you can enjoy. We'd love you to check out our website, mission-driven.org. You can get Mike's book there. There's other resources that are coming down the pipeline. We have a new resource that is just about to be published called Mission Driven Basics. And Church Strategy Made Simple is the subtitle for that. So that's another great little resource that you can look forward to. We'd love it if you came and liked our Facebook page or follow us on Twitter. There's lots of ways to stay connected with us. But if you've been blessed by this podcast, we encourage you to share it. Share it with a pastor friend. Share it with your elders. Share it with anyone that you think has an interest in being mission-driven, because we believe that our role is to help ignite the vision and guide the journey so that all of us can be mission-driven together. So once again, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you back here again next time on Mission Driven Podcast.